In this chapter, we'll learn about the technological precursors of the radio and the key innovators in that history. We'll learn a little bit about the early days of unregulated radio and the expansion of the network system and its eventual regulation. And additionally, how critical the radio was as a means of communication in times of crisis and how it became a form of entertainment that influenced later forms of broadcast and even digital entertainment. And finally, we'll consider the role of radio in the music industry and the culture and how the sonic medium and the industries that are organized around it connect to our social and political lives. Our book outlines some of the important precursors of radio, particularly the telegraph, which was first developed by the American inventor Samuel Morse, famous for the Morse code, which was a series of dots and dashes that stood in for letters in the alphabet. There's some really great examples of that online if you feel like Googling. And this was transmitted as a set of sounds of beeps produced in different succession. And were used primarily for news and messages transmitted by telegraph operators by interrupting an electrical current along a wire cable. This was first set up between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, but within 20 years of its invention in the 1840s, ran coast to coast by 1861. Our textbook highlights many innovators and inventors that played key roles in the development of modern radio. Aside from Samuel Morse, Nikola Tesla is generally considered to be the father of radio for his invention of the wireless communication system in 1892. Marconi built on a lot of Tesla's work to create point-to-point telephony, or communication between 2 points. Additionally, Alexander Popov made similar discoveries in Russia at the same time. Lee de Forest developed something that was called the Audion tube, which was a small but critically important device that allowed for the detection and amplification of weak radio signals. Earlier radio worked on AM signals, but Edwin Howard Armstrong later developed FM radio, which was less prone to interference and had a higher sound quality due to having higher bandwidth. And finally, David Sarnoff, who eventually started RCA, was an important figure in early radio because he developed and pioneered the concept of broadcasting sonic media, making the radio into a space where information and entertainment could be shared to a large number of people at once. So broadcast, but broad. In the early days of wireless radio, it lacked any form of regulation. The first form of regulation was the Radio Act of 1912, which sought to address some of the crises that arose in that period and which had potentially disastrous effects for ships in the use of ship-to-shore radio because airwaves were often being crammed. And so it imparted the requirement for licensing and also adopted an SOS distress signal, which could interrupt any other form of radio wave. In the wake of World War I, the radio and its emerging potential for mass communication, many things began to change, and Sarnoff's Radio Corporation of America, RCA, and its acquisition of American Marconi, Tesla and Armstrong's patents, and other companies, RCA became a monopoly just as broadcast radio was arriving. Broadcast radio officially arrives in 1921 when the U.S. Commerce Department licensed 5 stations and the age of broadcast radio began. There wasn't much regulation at the time, and so radio stations were popping up all over the place. By the 1920s, we start to see network radio, which centralized radio stations into a few companies. These networks created a contract model for radio talent, where they would be hired by the network to do various shows and entertainment programs. The first radio companies are probably familiar to you, NBC and CBS, as well as RCA. NBC and CBS will be familiar because they also become television networks later. At this time, there are 2 types of radio that dominate, or stations that are owned and operated by a network. And alternatively, there are also affiliate stations, which are stations contracted to run programming, like content, from the major networks, but they themselves were owned by other companies. Radio was hugely significant as a part of social and cultural life in the 1930s. During the Depression in the United States, radios were relatively cheap, and people could often afford to get them for their homes when other forms of entertainment were no longer available to them. Radio provided entertainment while other forms of entertainment, like vaudeville, which were traveling theater shows that had been integral, started to decline. Radio provided escape for people who were struggling with their daily lives and lived reality because the Depression was an incredibly difficult time for many people. And this might sound familiar to all of us because I think many of us interact with media today as a form of escape or distraction, and also as a means of connection to other people. Maybe not radio, but other forms of media for us, hence the rise of TikTok during COVID. Early radio programming wasn't something that existed 24/7 like today. Radio was on during a more limited amount of hours, usually in the evening, and was designed to be experienced by the whole family together, gathered around a radio. Early radio programming included soap operas, game shows, news talk shows, and even early versions of reality television. The book authors argue that we can understand early radio by what's called the parsimony principle, or the idea that the material was used up as sparingly as possible, repeated as often as possible, and shared as widely as possible. So shows were often repeated. Most shows had only one sponsor, so advertising was not yet competitive on the format. So just as we saw in music, also radio and the programming that appeared there was often problematic and reflected the racism and other issues of the time. So popular shows, for instance, were Amos and Andy, which stereotyped Black characters and ran for many years and was finally canceled in 1953 amid the strengthening civil rights movement. As radio became more powerful and popular in the early 20th century, legislators needed to regulate the medium as there were many monopolies beginning to develop. The first of these was the Federal Radio Act of 1927, which created a governing body. And then next came the Federal Radio Commission. And this was followed not long after by the Communications Act of 1934, which replaced the prior board with the Federal Communications Commission that still exists today and became the standard of media regulation for the next 60 years. Some of the legal issues for radio competition came from NBC, which developed two networks under their umbrella called NBC Red and NBC Blue so that they could get around regulations and spread their network into more areas. In 1934, another smaller network, Mutual, ended up using NBC and CBS for similar tactics, arguing that they had unfair control over the market. In 1943, a court decision passed the chain broadcasting decision, which states that no one can own two networks out in the same market. And as a result of this, NBC had to sell their Blue network, which actually became ABC, the third largest network in the country. At the peak of radio as a medium, NBC was rated number one because it had the best entertainment shows. CBS was in perennial number two in the ratings, but notably had the best news division compared to the other network and played a large role in keeping people informed during World War II. ABC was third in the ratings pretty regularly, and in the radio area, they didn't really find specific strengths like NBC did. ABC actually grew when it transitioned to television much more than it had ever been successful as a radio network. These networks' ratings could carry over into early television, and these networks were the same as those that began the model of network television. In response to the control of the network system, in 1948, the government began authorizing non-commercial licenses and approved 10-watt FM stations, Pacifica Foundation, and these were designed to challenge the status quo. During the 1960s, nonprofit broadcasting found Congress to be sympathetic to an old idea that radio and television should be used as educational tools. As a result, National Public Radio, which you'll know as NPR, and the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, were created as the first non-commercial networks under the provision of the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPDB, NPR and PBS were mandated to provide alternatives to commercial broadcasting. Today, NPR's popular news and interview programs such as Morning Edition and All Things Considered are thriving and contributing to the network's weekly audience of 32 million listeners. Over the years, however, public radio has faced decreasing government support and the threat of losing its federal funding. In 1994, a conservative majority in Congress cut financial support and threatened to scrap CPB, the funding authority for public broadcasting. And again, in 2011, the House voted to end financing for CPB, but the Senate voted against that measure. Consequently, stations have become more reliant on private donations and corporate sponsorship, which can cause some public broadcasters to steer clear of controversial subjects, especially those that critically examine corporations upon whom they are now more dependent for donations. This week, I assigned listening for you to an episode of Chenjerai Kumanyika on Code Switch, a podcast where he talks about how important public radio and NPR in particular are, but where he also talks about the ways that it has limited what kinds of voices we hear and what kinds of voices we think of as having authority on politics and the news. It's a pretty good episode. I hope you guys like it. Another important innovation in radio leads to its increased popularity and the home for it that I think most of us are still familiar with, if even then. We all have aux cables now. But the car suddenly becomes an important place for the radio because of the development of transistors. Transistors are small electrical devices that receive and amplify radio signals and make radios portable. So the expansion of portability of the radio, the rise of FM radio at the same time, and eventually the growing popularity of television together worked to change the format and programming on radio. Rather than evening, family-friendly radio shows, the radio began to focus more exclusively on music and often on youth markets, as they were also connected to the expanding car industry in America. The top 40 format radio was formula-driven and management-controlled programming, playing top songs many times over during the day. The top 40 are the 40 most popular hits of that week, measured by record sales. This gets complicated, too, when we start to think about a problem called payola. Payola was when DJs were paid to play particular records to privilege those records over others, meaning that they were then pushing the sales that would then also reflect what became the top 40. One of your required media this week is a short TikTok that explains how rock and roll developed in part through the gatekeeping of the music industry, and how we look at, so the way that they would look for white singers to sing music that had previously been played by Black musicians. This is connected also to the system of payola and the appropriation of Black artists' work, in that even if Black artists were making these recordings, radio stations were still being paid primarily to play white musicians. The system of payola went unregulated until the 2000s, when in 2007, the largest broadcasting company was forced to pay $12.5 million as a result of an FCC payola investigation. But in many ways, payola still exists. For instance, Spotify has a program where it offers more exposure for songs whose distributors are willing to take less in percentage of profit. There's a good article about that too for you. The next major legislation that impacted radio came with the Television Act of 1990, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This act reversed earlier regulations and actually eliminated most ownership restrictions in radio. This led to greater consolidation and power for larger radio companies, arguably resulting in less diversity on the radio and more conglomeration. Many see this act as a move to deregulate media more broadly, rather than to provide stronger protections for the public and consumers. As we've discussed with other forms of media, advertising had an important role to play, even though only 10% of media advertising goes to radio. This still has a great deal of influence, as do the limited number of corporate controls in the conglomeration that was made possible by the Telecommunications Act. Important forms of alternative radio, though, have been around for as long as radio has been in people's homes. A recent example of alternative radio is from the 1990s, when activists set up pirate stations to protest large corporate control over the radio. Due to the success of pirate radio in 2000, the FCC approved non-commercial lower power FM or LPFM stations to give voice to local groups who had wanted to gain access but were up until that point lacking the ability to access the airwaves. New radio technologies began to really shift the way the radio functioned in the 2000s with the emergence of satellite radio, which created a subscription-based national service through a series of satellites launched to cover the continental United States. These were accessible through mobile devices, satellite radios, and cars with satellite bands. And around the same time, also HD radio, a digital technology that enabled multicasting by AM and FM broadcasters, began to provide program data as well. Today's radio landscape involves AM radio, which is mostly dominated by news and talk programs, FM radio, which is still primarily top 40 and mainly music focused. There also continues to be an increasing amount of niche and micro-niche formats, so more specific interests and contents are covered, particularly with streaming. This is especially seen in podcasts, but also reflected in radio more broadly. Digital and internet radio drives the radio landscape today in many ways, so the majority of Americans listen to radio online, and things like podcasts provide more on-demand forms of radio, so you don't have to wait to catch a program at a particular time. And you can listen when you're ready to platforms like Spotify and Pandora. Additionally, what's interesting about this is that a lot of local radio stations are now also available online, so you can listen to local stations in many different places and are no longer limited to being in a specific location. The contemporary format of the podcast has given new life to sonic media. Podcast is a portmanteau of iPod and broadcast, because they were originally primarily connected to iPods, although they didn't really rise to prominence and the level of interest that we see now until the expansion of smartphones. Podcasting is the practice of making audio files available on the internet to download or to stream. And they're the most recent continuation of the radio tradition and have brought back a lot of forms of old radio, including scripted programming as well as more news-focused and interview-based. They provide portable listening and have challenged the traditional radio industry and other forms of broadcast news, bringing us the possibility of new voices, as Chandra talks about in his brief episode of Code Switch. As of 2017, an estimated 1 in 3 people listen to podcasts. And this week's assignment for your participation activity, I'm asking you to share with me a podcast that you find interesting, and I'm curious to see the conversations you guys have. One of the things that makes podcasts in particular, as I said, we can share across space, but they also offer a new form of us understanding some of the important politics of the history of radio. Um, Podcasting gives us an opportunity for intimate and authentic connections. There are more than 400,000 podcasts currently available, and 45% of all of those podcasts really try to address society and culture in the way that a lot of historic radio programs also did, forming an important political force in America, although definitely one that's still siloed and not broadcast, right? So we choose what to listen to as opposed to all sharing in the same experience in the way of radio, which was popular particularly in the Depression. As radio was the first national electronic mass media, its influence in the formation of American culture really can't be overestimated. And not only American, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Radio has given us the beginning of soap operas, situation comedies, broadcast news. It helped popularize various areas of music, car culture, and the politics of talk radio. Yet, for all of its national influence, broadcast radio in the United States is still a supremely local medium. For decades, listeners have tuned in to hear familiar voices of community DJs and talk shows and the regional flavor of popular music over large publicly owned airwaves. Some final notes on closing thoughts on sonic media. Sonic media has offered us a lot of connections and a lot of possibilities. Some of those opportunities are that sonic media can give us cross-cultural connections, whether that's listening to music from different cultures and having access to radio programs from other places. Sonic media often gives us the opportunity to test boundaries, whether through music and questions of social norms available in popular music, or through the expansion of the voices that we have access to through something like podcasting. It gives us the possibility of a sense of intimate and authentic connections on complex issues, particularly in podcasting, but also in other forms of radio and music commentary on social issues. It forms a possibility for free expression and changing culture. It also gives us an opportunity for different forms of storytelling than we have available to us in large formats that are really financially demanding, like television or film. However, there are a lot of challenges that also come with sonic media, tensions between that we also see in other forms of media. So tensions between the creative and profit motives that have definitely affected the way that music is made, produced, and shared, as well as other forms of media, including podcasts and what we can access. Uh, Sonic media, like all forms of media, often reproduces and amplifies inequalities in culture, making problematic politics norms. So we see this in the siloing of talk radio. We see this in the problems of old programming like Amos and Andy. And also the final question that we have of how to handle the challenges of sonic media is, what do we do to regulate sonic technologies and ownership of these massive corporations that have control over what we have access to? So that's it for this week's lectures. If you haven't already, read chapters 4 and 5. There's also a short article on challenging the whiteness of public radio and a documentary on the history of sound, especially radio, but going all the way back to Telegraph by Ken Burns. It's a great documentary. It is a little slow. I'm not going to deny that. So, be prepared. And I'm not going to ask you a ton of questions on it, but it will be on your quiz next week. So definitely make sure you watch it. Bringing us to that, we have a quiz coming up next week. I will have a study session, or the normal office hours next Monday night will actually be study office hours in case you have questions. Check out the syllabus for the rules on how quizzes work. Your participation coming up this week is going to be on a podcast share, and that participation activity is connected to the writing and audio piece from Chandra Kumanika. So you'll want to be choosing a podcast and thinking about who the speakers are, who the audiences are, and how that connects to some of the things that we learned about this week in both radio technology history and also origins of podcast and recorded music. And then lastly, you have a writing analysis option this week. If you really want to do another one after this week, which I know is challenging for a lot of people, you can do one that's a mini study on music and the generations, looking at how people experience music across different generations around you and your community. So that's it. And you're doing great. Hang in there. If anyone has any questions, let me know. Remember, if you did feel extra challenged by this first writing analysis assignment, you do have the opportunity at the end of the semester to choose one of them to rewrite and resubmit for extra credit. So you're welcome to do that. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about that. I'm sorry I don't take drafts in advance, but I'm always happy to go over what worked and what didn't and take a resubmit. Okay, that's it for this week. Good luck with everything. And I hope you guys are doing all right with all the rainy weather we've been having. Take care.